Everyone needs compassion, love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of a Savior, the hope of nations.
Good morning and welcome to Bethany.
Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. So take me as you find me, all my fears and failures. Fill my life again. Give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I
Lord, I come before you and I confess that this is the desire of my heart, but so often does not match what I do day to day. Lord, I pray that as we continue to dig into 1 Timothy, Lord, that you would give us eyes to see your vision for our lives, God, that we would turn our focus off of ourselves, that we would turn to you, Lord, that the cry of our hearts would be to desire to honor you, Lord, to worship you, to give everything we have in praise for who you are and what you have done on the cross for us. We praise you and we thank you for bringing us here, for giving us your Son. Amen. You may be seated. We will take the offering.
In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, and my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones he came to save. Till on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. For every sin on him was laid. Here in the death of Christ I live. There in the ground his body lay, light of the world, my darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From lust prescribed to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand.
We will dismiss the Sunday school at this point, and Matthew Duquette will be bringing us the word from 1 Timothy.
Okay, so, big question. Who here is watching the World Cup? You guys are such Americans. Just because your team isn't in doesn't mean you can't watch it, okay? You guys got to get over that. So, I think most of us know the basics of soccer, so I'm going to run with it, okay? So, there are some positions on the soccer field that are more desirable maybe for you or for me. Some have more attention, some have less attention. The ones whose primary job it is to score typically have a little bit more attention on them. The midfield, less attention. They're not really primarily responsible for scoring or defending. They're kind of, a little bit of both. And then you have the defense, pretty important job. And you have the goalie, high stress, high pressure. So the strikers or the scorers, they can't win the game. They can't even do their job of scoring if the defense and the goalie, the midfield, don't do their jobs of protecting. If the defense feels like, the strikers aren't really doing a very good job and they want to decide, we're going to go play some offense, what's going to happen now? Well, now you're going to lose because you don't have a defense. A soccer team, a football club, can't function when the players have not embraced their roles on the team. We as a church also can't function when the body doesn't embrace our roles. Where would we be as a church if Ray Duclos decided this morning that he was not going to go get the donuts and make the coffee? We would be a mess. Paul in 1 Timothy is dealing with a church who became tired of their roles. Tired of the roles that they were created to and made to embrace. They thought that they could do a better job than those who were supposed to be doing that job. Or they became weak. They stopped fighting the good fight of faith that they had been called to. What does Paul say to this church? What does Paul say to the church body who no longer values, who no longer embraces the roles that they are called to? If you would, open your Bibles to 1 Timothy chapter 2. You're looking at verses 8 through 15 this morning. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise, also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, in love, and holiness with self-control. So, men, stop arguing. Women, dress appropriately. Be quiet. Be submissive. Never teach. Never have authority over men. Did I mention to be quiet? Okay, all done. Worship team, come on up. All right. There's a lot going on here. Paul is dealing with a church who is distracting one another from what is truly important. Paul is dealing with a church who no longer embrace their roles within a Christian church body. Because of this, he has to rein them in. So we're going to start with the problematic verses first, and then we're going to go from there. Okay, so verses 11 and 12. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. In order to understand these verses, we have to sort of read between the lines here. What are Paul's instructions to Timothy regarding the women at the church of Ephesus? I have on the left, verse 11. On the right is verse 12. In the middle, both verses. So on the left, what are they to do? The women of the church of Ephesus are to. They are to learn, and they are to do it with all submissiveness. On the right, what they are not to do, they are not to teach, they are not to exercise authority, and both, he mentions it twice, quiet. So, what was happening here that Paul needed to correct? I don't believe that Paul would tell women to stop teaching and to stop exercising authority over men if they weren't doing this. Furthermore, he wouldn't say that if he didn't think that it was wrong for whatever reason. So let's start with the pros. Paul says that the women of Ephesus should learn. Okay, how's that a pro? There's a rabbi who was once quoted as saying, "It's better to burn the Torah than to teach it to a woman." Better to burn the Torah than teach it to a woman. Now, this church didn't comprise of Jews or people of a Jewish background. In verse 7, right before this section, Paul reminds Timothy that he was appointed a preacher, a teacher, and an apostle to the Gentiles. He is dealing with a church who did not have the same sense of gender-specific roles within a church. He's saying it's good for the women of the church to learn the scriptures. This wasn't the case for all temples or Jews at this time. In both verses, Paul mentions to be quiet. Now, quiet goes hand in hand with learning. So you have to kind of look at it within that realm. If someone is actively teaching, it's probably best to be quiet. I think the idea here is just not to be disruptive. The church at Ephesus, women, I'm sure men too, were being disruptive to the church service, disruptive to the learning. For whatever reason, Timothy gets this report to Paul, and Paul writes back saying, okay, they need to be, we got to be quiet. We can't be disrupting the church service. Can't be disrupting the teaching that's happening. Now, this principle for us applies to both men and women. And I think we all could agree it's probably the most beneficial to a church service. So did you hear that, babies? Be quiet. So, the second pro is that of submission. This is a little bit harder for me to say. He's imploring the women of the church to submit to the leaders of the church. We don't have to go far to see this idea of submission to one another. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, remember this is 1 Timothy, who is in Ephesus. This is kind of like 2nd Ephesians, okay? In 1st Ephesians, or the letter to the Ephesians, he lays out a model for a marriage relationship. That in which the husband is the head of the household. Above the husband is Christ as the head, and then the wife is to submit to him, her husband. Now, Paul is attempting to establish a similar relationship here within the church, where there are male leaders who are the head of the church, who have Christ above them, and then there are the women of the church who are under the men. But we'll get a little more on this later. So what does Paul ask women not to do? It says, don't teach, don't exercise authority over men. So why would Paul be saying this? To read between the lines is that Ephesian women had begun teaching and being the authoritative figures in the form of church leadership. Another way of translating exercising authority is that they shouldn't usurp authority. So not exercising, but usurping the authority. It's taking leadership that wasn't given to them. They bypassed the role of the elders, the overseers, and became the primary teachers and leaders of the church. Paul had established this church in the book of Acts and he had put in place the leaders. He knew who he put in place. But they have reversed their leadership here in Ephesus, and unfortunately, this church also has issues with false teaching now. So the women had taken over the church, and Paul is trying to put the authority and the duties of teaching back into the hands of men. Why? What was his reasoning? If it was just because women were teaching false doctrines or false teachings, he would just say, women, stop teaching false teachings, or learn to correct your way of thinking, and then you can go back and teaching again. So let's look at verse 13. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. He goes back to the Garden of Eden to establish or support this idea that God intended a hierarchy in creation. Adam was created first, then Eve was created. Why was Eve created? God saw Adam was alone, and he deemed that it was not good. The first thing that wasn't good about his creation was that Adam was alone. So Eve was created, why? To be a helper and companion fit for him, fit for Adam. Verse 14. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Paul is creating a picture, not a very good picture, but a picture that he likens the women in Ephesus to Eve. Eve had been deceived by the serpent. The women of Ephesus had been deceived by the false teachers. Seemingly, who gets off the hook here? Adam does. Eve was deceived. Adam was not deceived. Adam is then likened to the men at Ephesus. But we need to take a little closer look at the Garden of Eden to really understand what Paul is saying here. Adam was formed first. God tells Adam that he has reign over the creation, except one thing. He can't eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. After this, Eve is created. When the serpent begins questioning Eve, did God really say that? Is that really what he meant? Oh, he didn't actually mean that. Who's standing right there beside her? Adam. When Eve is deceived, she bites of the fruit, and who does she hand it to? Adam, who also bites of the fruit. Well, Eve may have been deceived by the serpent, but Adam knowingly disobeyed and sinned against God. Eve was deceived, Adam disobeyed. While it doesn't seem like a good analogy for the women at Ephesus as being tricked and deceived, it's actually far worse for the men at Ephesus. They have stood idly by while serpents, false teachers have come in and deceived the church. They did not step up to right the wrongs. They did not take ownership over their church. They did not take ownership over the body. And they knowingly disobeyed God. So, what is our takeaway here? Fighting the good fight of faith is taking ownership of our roles within the church. Fighting the good fight of faith is embracing the roles that we have within our church body. So Paul establishes his views for how the church should run. Men at the head, as the elders, overseers, and primary teachers of the body. So how does this make sense to Timothy? Now, Paul is obviously writing to Timothy. How does this make sense to him? Timothy, once he became a member of the faith, who was he taught the scriptures by? His mother and his grandmother. He was taught by women. How does this make sense to Timothy? Is Paul saying that this is not permitted to Timothy? Apollos, another famous Christian out of Ephesus, once he began teaching, he was told that he wasn't correct in his thinking. He wasn't correct in his teaching. And so who was he taught by? Priscilla and her husband, Aquila. Is Paul also saying that this isn't right? I don't think he is. What Paul is correcting here is a church whose leadership had been flipped. Men had become weak. Women usurped the authority. They became the primary teachers. Ellie Greenhalgh, Dave's wife Ellie, is downstairs right now doing what she does pretty much every Sunday she's here, just teaching the next generation at Bethany Gospel Chapel. Ellie has seemingly devoted her entire life to teaching the next generation. Maybe it's because she has given up on the current generation. I don't know. Many of you, men and women, leaders and non-leaders, teach the Sunday school, you teach at Kids Club, you teach in the nursery, you teach at Bible studies, you teach through discipleship, you teach through your actions. Personally, I wouldn't want to be a part of a church where this doesn't happen, where this is not the case. The women are a crucial part of what we do here. It's amazing. Most of you here this morning are members of this church. You've been coming for a while. I can't imagine that these verses are all that uncomfortable for you. You are all a part of a church where the men preach, where the men are elders. Paul's harsh words are less for the women of this church, they're more for the men. So, men, accept your role. Embrace your role. Fight the good fight of faith. Lead your households. Lead your church through the eldership, through the teaching. Not standing idly by, not through your weakness of faith. Women, embrace the roles that you have, because we need to fight this fight together. Can't be fighting this fight separately. We must be united in truth, for all are essential to this body. What other roles are we to embrace? Verses 9 and 10. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Paul uses a clothing analogy to describe how women and men should conduct themselves within the church. In these verses, Paul is directing this at only women, but all can take the principle here. Braided hair, gold, pearls, and costly attire are being described as being immodest and lacking self-control. This is rooted in a cultural issue. Paul is pinpointing an issue of immodesty. Women who are known for what they wear and how they do their hair and what jewelry they put on. The issue is not in gold or pearls. I bought my wife pearls for Christmas. They're not real pearls. We can't afford pearls, but you know, they sort of look like pearls. Issue is not in those things. It's not in braided hair. Okay? The issue is the immodest and lack of self-control. The word self-control that's used here is sexual in nature. This goes beyond wearing some jewelry. The clothing was used to distract one another from worship. Paul also calls out what he says costly attire. The sense behind costly is an extreme cost. It's the same idea as when the woman was crying and sobbing and anointed Jesus' feet days before he was crucified. And one of the disciples said, "Oh, that's not good. We shouldn't be using that. That's expensive stuff. We could sell that. We can give it to the poor." It's that much money. It's costly attire. It's very expensive. It's not suggesting that if you wear clothes, they better be made by you, or they better be from the clearance rack, or maybe they should be modeled after clothing worn in Little House on the Prairie. Costly, one commentary put it, could cost up to a year's wage, or up to 3 years' wage. That is expensive clothing. The women at Ephesus were putting an extreme importance on their outward appearance. They were promoting their wealth, and they were promoting immoral behavior. They were seeking to be a distraction from the church by being noticed for this expensive clothing, their elaborate hairdos, and promiscuous dress. This applies to men too. Men, not braiding their hairs, but men need to understand that they can't be putting an emphasis on their outward appearances. They can't be putting an extreme emphasis on the jewelry they wear or how much money they make, and making sure everyone knows how much money they make. Now, Paul is seeking to keep us from these distractions. He's trying to keep us from these distractions and to embrace our role of godliness, being godly men and women. So how does Paul expect you to dress? Well, he switches the analogy in verse 10. Verse 10, he says, "Clothed with what is proper for men and women who profess godliness." They should be clothed with good works. We are to be known for our good works, not our physical appearance, not with what we wear, not with how we do our hair. Aren't you very glad that you didn't wear your bathing suit this morning? So these chunk of verses starts in verse 8. So verse 8, "I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling." So men, I'm going to talk to you specifically now. Remember the 3 P's of verse 8. The first one, embrace the role of one who prays. Paul's desire is that in every place, every church, every household, men should pray. This is not limiting prayer to men. Paul makes that clear in 1 Corinthians 11, where he establishes guidelines for women praying in a church service. Paul is once again fighting against this church's flipped leadership. He is doing so by making it clear that the men should be leading by example, by leading by praying, leading by being known for their prayer. It's not a suggestion. Men could pray. Men should consider praying. Men might pray. No, men should pray. Second, embrace the role of one who prepares, the role of a preparer. Lifting holy hands connects back to the Old Testament. When a priest would prepare for a sacrifice, when a priest would prepare to go into the temple, they would wash their hands. They're preparing themselves. Holy hands, or lifting holy hands, obviously, is a posture of prayer that was used in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and now as well. It's one of the many postures for prayer. But he's saying lifting the hands that had been prepared, showing up to church with hearts that have been prepared for worship. Hearts that have been prepared for teaching, for exhorting, for fellowship with one another. The third P, embrace the role of a peacemaker. Anger and quarreling had become an issue for the men at Ephesus. Anger and quarreling over false teachings, over women. The men had become a distraction to their church as well. They had become a distraction to the worship because their hands were being raised, not for prayer. Their hands were being raised out of anger towards one another. We must embrace the role of a peacemaker. Finally, verse 15. "Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith, in love, in holiness, with self-control." This passage almost made sense, and then you get to verse 15. "Women will be saved by giving birth to children." Paul is most known for his phrase, "Grace is by what alone? Faith alone." Is Paul contradicting himself here? Does Paul believe that the Ephesian women, or all women, need to give birth in order to be saved? No. I think there are 2 explanations for what Paul is saying. We can get some clues from a few verses down in chapter 4, verse 3, where he says that there are those who are teaching the forbidding of marriage. A false teaching that forbids marriage is present, and Paul needs to correct their thinking once again. It's good to be married. It's good to have children. Whew. Right, Scott? Right, Elizabeth? Yep. The teachers are saying we shouldn't be getting married. It's not good for the church. We shouldn't be doing this. It's forbidden. And Paul says, no, that's not it at all. He's saying it's good to be married. It's good to have children. Paul also says in 1 Corinthians that it's good to be single. He's dealing with two separate issues here, right? In this case, in 1 Timothy, he's dealing with people who are saying, you can't get married. He's saying, no, of course you can get married. So the second explanation for this, childbirth bringing about salvation, can be found back in the garden. Verses 13, 14, and 15 are very heavily connected with the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve take of the fruit and they eat of it, God comes and tells them the consequences for their actions. God starts with the serpent. In verse 15 of chapter 3 in Genesis, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He, the woman's offspring, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his head. Her offspring shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. God has ordained Eve and all women's offspring to be in conflict with the serpent, to be in conflict with Satan. At the end of Romans, Paul writes to them at his closing and says, the God of peace will soon crush your head. God of peace will crush your head under the feet of the disciples. Paul is asking the women at Ephesus to take pride in their womanhood, to take pride in motherhood, to take pride in bearing and rearing children, those who are yours and those who are not yours, those children who will continue in this judgment, to those who will continue in God's discipline of the serpent, that his head will be crushed. Eve is the image of women and of all men and women who have sinned. As alluded to in the garden, we all have been saved thanks to childbearing. We all have been saved thanks to the one who stood up to the lies, who stood up to the deceits of the serpent. We've all been saved thanks to childbearing, the child that was a ransom for our sins. We all have been saved by the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, last, embracing your roles as those who have been saved by the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. Embracing your womanhood, your motherhood, and the faith, love, and holiness that's necessary for those who have been saved. So, to wrap up, we must be embracing these roles within our church. Whatever role it is that you have, embrace your role, whether that is leadership or not leadership. Also need to be embracing our godliness, our good works, being known for your good works. Men, the 3 Ps, be known for being prayers, people who pray, preparers, and peacemakers. And let us embrace the role of ones who have been saved, continuing in our faith, love, and holiness. I'm going to ask the music team to come up. We're going to go into a time of meditation. I have a few questions for you. You can consider pondering. Is my worth based on my role here? Like a body with many parts, we here at this church have many parts as well. We can't do it without you and your role. But where does your worth come from? Is it from what you do, or does your worth come from who you are? We are loved by God. We are one of his children. That is our worth. Our worth comes from being a member of the family of God and a valuable member here at his body in Swansea. Am I known for my works or for something else? Are you known for how you dress, your profession, your anger, your faith, love, and good works? And lastly, how have I prepared for worship today? Am I a prepared, peacemaking prayer? Continue in faith, love, and holiness.
Rise up and sing of the great and glorious King. You are strong when you feel weak. In your brokenness, complete. Shout to the north and the south. Sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. Rise up, women of the truth, stand and sing to broken hearts, who can know the healing power of our awesome King of love. Shout to the north and the south, sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. We will shout to the north and the south, sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. We've been through fire and we've been through rain. We've been refined by the power of His name. We've fallen deeper in love with You. You burn the truth on our lips. Shout to the north and the south, sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. Rise up, church, with broken wings. Fill this place with songs again of our God who reigns on high. By His grace again we'll fly. Shout to the north and the south, sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. We will shout to the north and the south, sing to the east and the west. Jesus is Savior to all, Lord of heaven and earth. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He's the Lord of heaven and earth.
Good morning, Bethany. Thank you, Matt, for bringing us through the passage this morning. Some difficult things there sometimes for us to consider, and we think about the world that we live in today and the conflict that we sometimes find between our culture and the church and how that's being worked out at Bethany and the worldwide church. A lot to think about there. I sort of think it's an interesting parallel with our time and 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire, and how there were women who spent hours a day on their appearance, slaves working for hours to do elaborate hair, things that you can still see in museums. You can still see those things that they spent their time and effort on, and the parallels in the world that we live in today with our obsession with celebrity and what the first lady is wearing or what boots a quarterback is wearing and that sort of thing. And it just distracts from what's truly important, what's truly essential in the spread of the gospel and how we're living our lives in a way that reflects God's glory rather than vanity. So thank you for that, Matt. A few things just to go over with you. Our missionary of the month is Michel Kimonier. He is serving with SIL, Bible Language Translation Project. So if we can continue to lift him up in prayer. And Melissa will be out in the foyer following the service. She'll be helping you out. That's important for a reason. She's going to be there. His mansion trip is happening at the end of this month, and a way that we can help them and partner with that trip, that service project, that opportunity to minister to the people at the mansion, is by taking a ticket for an item or two or three, whatever you'd like to do, for things that they're going to prepare for the residents and the staff up on the hill. All right, so they'll be taking over the kitchen for that weekend and doing service projects and that sort of thing while they're there. And we have, for the last several years, provided all the food for that, so it is not a burden on them in any way. And so our teams have brought up everything that's needed, and we've provided that stuff within our own body, providing the items, the ingredients that go into the meals for that weekend. So she'll be out in the foyer following the service, and if you want to know more, talk to her, and she'll have tickets, so you can take a ticket for different things and help out with that. With that, I'm assuming we're all set this morning. Any other things that I missed? Did you have something? I'm getting a point over this way.
Last Sunday at 4:41 p.m., Clara Elizabeth Morelli was
Nice job, Morellis, and welcome to our body, Clara. All right, with that, I send you forth today, and have a great week. Thank you.